Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar news update video. So this will be my thoughts on the Mike and Bryan interview. Basically, Braving the Elements episode 1 has come out. It was on my podcast feed this morning. I was surprised at how early it was there. Especially given that the YouTube premiere of the episode is not happening until later on tonight. I think it's at like 11 my time. I think it's like, is it 6 p.m. Eastern time is when that's airing. I have some of the details here in just a second. But yeah, I took some notes on this. My overall reaction would be that I was a little disappointed just because obviously we didn't really get Avatar Studios news. And then 2, I felt like just on all accounts there was just a lack of detail with these questions, as if like this could have been so much better if I think they had maybe given Mike and Bryan the questions maybe ahead of time to potentially just look stuff up. I really got the impression that a few of these questions maybe just surprised Mike and Bryan with just how like kind of detailed, or like they relied on them like remembering a very specific kind of detail, which they didn't, that sort of stuff, and they just really couldn't answer. And so that definitely, I think, affected just how interesting the podcast could be. And so many of the interesting topics that we have, obviously from the video I did the other day, covering like what the actual timestamp kind of segments are going to be on the podcast, just didn't really deliver overall. So it's one of those ones where like if you like interviews, if you like Michael Bryan interviews, obviously listen to it. It's still interesting, but I don't think it's an absolutely must listen to podcast. It's not on that level in my opinion. It in so many ways I think just didn't really have all that much that was super interesting. But let's go through it. So obviously, one of the big things we were waiting for is like, okay, there's about a minute at the start where apparently they're talking about current projects, so Avatar Studios. Here's what's roughly said. It's not an exact quote, but it's like, paraphrased basically. So Mike says basically, we're working on stuff, things, Avatar stuff. He does say everyone's working hard. It takes a long time to make animation. He does promise that it will all pay off, I suppose, once we get to see it, but he doesn't know when that will be. Okay. Bryan then says, he kind of leads off interestingly with mentioning that like again, it takes a long time. ATLA started work on it, I guess, spring 2002. The premiere was not until spring 2005, and along the way they only really did the test pilot at Comic-Con. He also, again, mentions animation is tough, especially because they are making a bunch of stuff all at once. So, massive nothing, massive non-content, non-comment, basically. This is probably the most significant thing in terms of, like, I don't even know when this interview was recorded or anything like that, because, like, if it was like 6 months ago, this might not mean maybe as much, but if it was more recent, like, I think that's a nice mention, at least, that they're confirming that that is the case. Because keep in mind, officially, we only know about that first movie. We know they're going to do other movies afterwards, but we don't actually know what multiple projects they are actually working on. So there's the October 2025 Aang and Friends movie. But then what is the other project? Like, the rumors would suggest that they're also working on the first series at the same time, and I think that would make a lot of sense. But we have no information on what that is. They've not announced anything overall. So this was just, it felt like, oh, we're going to be asked this question, I guess we have to comment on it. And they effectively said what they said on previous podcasts. Like, on like the first time I think they appeared on Braving the Elements, I think this is effectively what they said. This is their go-to answer these days when they don't have anything to say. I think probably the biggest criticism I would perhaps have of this is like, they don't even mention that, like, hey, we know that publicly we've told you that the first thing is a, Aang and Friends movie. They don't even mention like that. There's really no acknowledgement of like there being any information out there already, which I think is part of the problem here, is that it makes it feel like they are extraordinarily disconnected from the fandom, which is probably, like, it's fine, but like that they really are not aware what's going on. So that's that. Like, mentioning this is like, okay, like 3 years, and it's like, wait, well, what a coincidence. Like, next month it will be 3 years of Avatar Studios. I'm assuming this is just the case where we don't know when exactly they're talking about as, like, say, the first movie, when the start point of that was. Because, of course, February 2021, when they announced Avatar Studios, was just the announcement of the studio. They still had to, like, get staff and stuff like that. There was a lot of, like, you know, the initial job listings and stuff like that. So is he kind of talking about this in terms of, like, well, actually it's more like February 2022 is really the start point on the movie, and 3 years from there kind of ish is kind of what we're talking about. But again, it's just that idea of, like, no attempt to give the fans even a little bit of information. Just, again, the idea that the wait will be worth it, and that they are making a bunch of stuff all at once. I wish we had more context, like, officially, for what this actually means. From rumors, we at least have a sense for what this means, but again, it's a bit frustrating. Then getting into some of the other topics, they do really minorly bring up the whole idea of, like, Iroh and Bryan, I think it is, who says, well, he views it as, like, Iroh's about 10 years older than Ozai. This makes the rough idea of their ages as being, like, in or around, like, Ozai's 45, Iroh is 55. Again, part of the reason we don't know, like, Ozai and Iroh's ages exactly is just because the Fire Nation royal family tree is a bit of a mess when it comes to exact numbers. A lot of it put off by the fact that I think the way it works out is that Azulon would have had kids when he was, like, really, really old. And I basically the idea is that there should be, like, another generation. There should basically be another Fire Lord in there somewhere if this is to work out fully properly. I think they're going to just have to go with the idea that, like, some people in the Avatar world just kind of last a bit longer, but it's a bit of a weird situation. But, you know, it's nice to sort of get that in their heads they always view it as, like, Iroh's 10 years older than Ozai, which makes sense based on their general looks. The listing on the timestamps that mentions Avatar novels and also names for Fire Lords is basically a combined topic of Janet Varney was looking at the art book, specifically this page, where they have the five Fire Lord portraits. So you have Ozai, Azulon, Sozin's father, Sozin's grandfather. Effectively, Janet Varney is asking, like, have you come up with names for these two characters? Now, of course, the problem that we have here is that Janet Varney references this, and then Mike and Bryan, off the top of their heads, do not know what for sure she's referring to. So they know from context a bit of what's being referred to here, but there's some detail that's lost here. So Mike brings up that, like, well, we have other names of Fire Lords in the novels, but, like, obviously, I think as he's answering this, he's like, I don't know the names off the top of my head. So obviously, just as an insert here, Yosor is mentioned as being a Zito era Fire Lord. Gonryu is the Yang Chen era Fire Lord that we hear about in the Yang Chen novels. And then we know about Cheryu and Zoryu from the Kyoshi era novels. And then just a note from me, this is my comment here, I would be surprised if we don't find out the name of Sozin's father in the Roku novel, because of when it's set, when it's still Prince Sozin. Just from a kind of Fire Nation world building point of view of, like, Roku's going to be dealing with living in the Fire Nation but now going to the Air Temple, I'd be surprised if we don't get Firebending Fire Nation world building to at least address who the current ruler is. That's been a very common thing in the novels, is to establish the politics of the era, which basically requires you to mention who the leaders of the era are. So I'm assuming that might be what Bryan was referring to, like, initially, that, like, we have other stuff like this more planned out now, because of Avatar Studios, that it probably is Roku novel, but really got the impression that he didn't have the information off the top of his head to mention anything. But that's the idea. So yeah, we expect to at least get this guy's name here. Again, based on the years and stuff like that, keep in mind the idea is that Sozin's father, I'm guessing, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but is probably a Fire Lord who maybe spanned at least the end of the Kyoshi era, but it's hard to say for sure. Either way, that's the way it kind of theoretically should work. And then Sozin's grandfather here should be basically a Kyoshi era Fire Lord. I think that's roughly how the timeline should work on it. Anyway, the expanding Piandao segment is probably the most disappointing one in terms of the wording of it, in terms of like, they're just talking about Piandao and Janet Varney is just like, hey, talk about who he's based on. And they just mentioned that, oh yeah, it's Sifukisu. And that's really all there is here. Any hope that they mention like the extra information that there is about Piandao and actually mention details? No. The Avatar Kook segment is basically just Janet asked the question, which is basically, did you ever have a plan to do a Kook episode? Given that like Kyoshi effectively got an episode, Roku of course got kind of multiple times to shine. Mike basically is just like, hey, Escape from the Spirit World exists, and that covers more on the past avatars, and that's where we did Kook. Interestingly, he did actually mention that he had only recently been like notified that this existed like again, like, so it's him remembering this somewhat recently that it actually exists, which is an interesting one. But basically the idea is that like they never really had a plan to do a full-on Kook episode in the same vein as the other avatars, but they covered it in Escape from the Spirit World. Then they addressed the whole Line Turtle thing, and basically they just talk about how they had always foreshadowed it, like it's in the pilot. There are little bits and pieces along the way that this was always going to be like ancient kind of like background kind of lore and information. Along with that, they do mention that like it was never ever part of the plan. There was never a thought that Aang was going to actually kill Ozai. It was always going to be the case that, you know, this is how it actually worked out. Bryan especially really, you know, goes in on the whole idea of like Aang is an air nomad. Their culture works in that way where they don't kill. They like it's a big thing. Aang wants to follow that, and the whole Avatar: The Last Airbender, like him valuing his culture is an important thing. That's basically the point that gets made here. One of the most kind of like funny and but also kind of frustrating parts of the podcast was like, hey, the Firebending Masters, Mike, what's the origin of them? And Mike just laughs and is just like, I don't remember. And they kind of just move on, basically. Like, I think Bryan comes in and is just like, yeah, John O'Brien wrote the episode, so like we had it all planned out. But along the way, it's just like, we don't know off the top of our head. Like, it was a while ago. And it's this weird thing where it's clearly like Dante and Janet prompting them for information, but it's clear that like, say, Janet Varney probably could just reveal the stuff from the art book herself, and that we do know about this, and kind of make the podcast better from an information point of view by revealing that information herself, because she knows it, and obviously the two people she's interviewing don't know it off the top of their heads. That's a bit of a kind of frustrating point. The whole Hama theory point gets brought up here. The creators have not heard this theory. After Janet explains it, they just say, yeah, that's just a fan theory. But they also don't address the like core of the question, which is that when Janet explains it, it is the idea of basically there was a source behind why the Fire Nation came to the Southern Water Tribe to go after basically Katara, and then why Kaya had to sacrifice herself. They had a source that there was one waterbender. And the theory is obviously that the reason that the Fire Nation theoretically know there is a waterbender, but also why they would accept it to be a like adult, is that, well, Hama escaped all these years ago, so that means there's one out there. Obviously there's some holes in that kind of exact logic, but that's sort of the idea of that. But then they don't actually address, like, wait, how did the Fire Nation know about it? Because that suggests that someone told them about, like, a very young Katara showing signs of waterbending when she was quite young, before she's had any training or probably even has any sense that maybe she really is a bender. They know obviously at that point, but that's the kind of issue, is just like, wait, how is this known and what's going on there? Did someone betray the Water Tribe, or is there Fire Nation spies that we're talking about here? It's a frustrating part of the podcast that they don't answer the question, like, I think fully properly, but they do basically go with the idea of, like, I'm guessing Hama is not really connected to that plot point in this way. That's the point that I think they get across. While they don't really say much about it, they just say it's a fan theory. They don't really, I suppose, absolutely deny it, but I think the way that the segment is kind of worded, I really get the impression it's just like, yeah, we'll leave it to the fans there, but that they don't actually say what the situation is. Most challenging scene of book 3, Bryan says it was the energy bending light battle, just from a kind of art point of view, like storyboarding it. He felt it was going to be very complicated at that early stage, but he talks about how JM Animation actually nailed it, and there was I think he mentions that there was no kind of retakes that needed to be done on it. They actually got it perfect based off the storyboards, and he just talks about how, like, he was really thinking about lighting, especially in this scene, which makes a lot of sense, and that was obviously a major part of the plan. And that's where they ended. There's no, like, one more thing before we go, here's some interesting information. It's just, yep, podcast is over there, and that's it. So yeah, like I said, check out the podcast if you want. A lot of people do just like to hear Mike and Bryan kind of talk about things. Personally, I felt it was maybe a little low energy on their part, and I get it. Like, they're busy working on this stuff, and they of course they made a point at the very start of mentioning just how tough animation is and that whole idea, especially working on multiple at the same time. But it definitely, I think, the potential, especially given that we knew, like, the talking point was kind of high, and it is kind of almost impressive how uninteresting maybe a lot of the answers turned out to be. But, like, I don't want to be super critical of a podcast necessarily. Like I said, I think there's a lot of reasons for this, in terms of, like, they probably didn't have the time to super heavily plan everything out and give them the questions ahead of time to allow them to probably do the, in a way, bits and pieces of research required to answer some of these questions. But bits and pieces there that are kind of interesting, but, like, I really don't really think there's, like, an Avatar Studios headline hidden in what they say at the start. It's impressive how they just said nothing of note. And I get it, they don't want to set any expectations, I guess, when it's still quite a bit out, but it's just, come on. You have to know you're expecting these questions, given what's happening. And then the final thing would just be like, hey, what about that Braving the Elements premium thing? I don't have an Apple device, so I'm not sure if I can super check this out, because it seems to be an Apple Podcasts exclusive thing. I don't know the exact details of it. Best I could find is going through the whole Apple thing to Braving the Elements Premium is this. Subscribe to Premium on Apple Podcasts to listen to ad-free and early. Okay. Subscribers will also get access to bonus content twice a month. Doesn't say what that is. I think if I close this BTE Premium, there's one show up here. Now, my assumption is that is just the first episode here, ad-free. Podcast that I listen to, it had ads. That's a bit of an interesting one. But what's weird is that if I go back here, here, Braving the Elements, you can see here, this is just a standard feed. Apple Podcasts, they don't have the episode up, but it seems to be up on Premium. But if you go to any other, like, podcast platform, I think it's just there. So that's a little bit kind of weird. Like, if you really like Apple, and you don't want to pay the premium, that, like, you have to go somewhere else theoretically to get the podcast. We'll see when exactly they release the episode. Maybe it'll be alongside the YouTube video from before. Maybe they weren't meant to. Maybe there's a bit of a mistake here in terms of the feed going out as early as it has. But it was definitely the first episode. There's definitely an interview I hadn't heard before. They talked about it's the start of a new season. All the stuff lines up with what this is. It was the episode, so it's a bit of a weird situation. We'll see if they maybe explain it on maybe the second episode, because I'm assuming it'll be more, and here's more normally what we're doing here. I'm assuming it will be the awakening, but we'll see what happens there. So yeah, that has been the video. So in the comments, if you listen to the Mike and Bryan interview, let me know what your thoughts are. Do remember also that the live stream for this is happening later on the official Avatar YouTube channel, where apparently Janet and Dante are going to be in the chat. How much that's going to mean, I'm not sure. I'll probably check it out just to see if anything happens, but I'm not expecting much, given that the actual podcast itself didn't quite deliver. I'm not expecting much from the live chat. But let me know your thoughts on this podcast and your expectations versus what actually happened. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.